A nation is a historically constituted, stable community of people, formed on the basis of a common language, is subject to the law of change, has its history, its beginning, and end. It must be emphasized that none of the above characteristics taken separately is sufficient to define a nation. More than that, it is sufficient for a single one of these characteristics to be lacking, and the nation ceases to be a nation. Welcome everyone to Collective. First and foremost, please like, subscribe, and press that bell button, as that's one way you can support us for free. Now that's out of the way, you're probably wondering what was with that quote in the beginning. Well, that quote is the answer for why Marxism-Leninism would be best for indigenous nations around the world. We want to make note that this is not us dictating what indigenous nations should or shouldn't do. All indigenous nations have the right to self-determination. However, this is a Marxist analysis of how the science of Marxism-Leninism could be applied to indigenous nations for their fight for liberation.
Part 1. Capitalism, the enemy of Central and Southern American indigenous nations. Since Latin America had the misfortune to have its beauty and wealth sought after by the greedy despots of Europe, capitalism has not only been the enemy of the indigenous, but the driving force of colonization. Many would argue that this relationship is inverted, and while I don't disagree with that analysis, I do believe that in many ways, both capitalism and colonization had a, quote, positive feedback relationship. As European powers exhausted their resources, they needed to find new veins. As new veins and riches were found, colonization expanded. As it expanded, the need for more grew. Capitalism always demands more in a finite system. The nail in the coffin for millions of indigenous in both Latin and North America was driven in the year 1492. Christopher Columbus set out on his lust for wealth, with the Catholic Church fronting the bill. But what motivated the Crown and the Church to back such a lofty investment? As the European powers overflowed at their own borders, the competition to acquire new sources of precious metals and spices intensified. Europe, in only the last 1400 years, had essentially exhausted its own ability to procure the resources needed to maintain its composure. At the time, Europe had grown used to the resources that flowed in from Asia due to trade with those nations. However, as power changed in Asia, with the decline of the Mongol Empire and the rise of the Ottoman Turks, this trade became disrupted. Without these resources and amenities, Spain and Europe at large were looking at an impending decline. In the same year Columbus set out on his genocidal path, Spain had also completed its Reconquista. This holy war against Islam needed to be paid for. Spain's coffers were empty. According to the words of Chris Columbus by William D. Phillips Jr., quote, freed from their wartime financial burdens and anxious not to let the Asian trade fall exclusively into the hands of the Portuguese, the Catholic monarchs ignored their advisors and decided to take a chance on Columbus's eccentric scheme. What followed was centuries of colonization and enslavement of the indigenous nations of Central and Southern America. The Inca and the Aztec empires and all other native nations in the area would no longer exist in the capacity that they had for so long. While for the next few centuries, the borders of Central and South America would be drawn and redrawn, the indigenous descendants would still populate these territories. Profit and resources flowed in from the indigenous territories to Europe. As generations passed, Europe would attempt to maintain its grip on indigenous lands. This eventually accumulated to the Spanish-American Wars for Independence. What may seem like an ancient history becomes much more relevant when we fast forward to a more recent time. After the Latin American Wars for Independence, capitalist forces continued their campaigns against the indigenous nations. One of the most famous examples we can examine happened in Guatemala in 1952. In 1944, amidst the Second World War, the Guatemala Revolution was underway. The peasant class had toppled the military dictatorship of Jorge Ubugo, following the first democratically elected president of Guatemala, Jacobo Arbenz. Arbenz was incredibly popular and instituted land reform for the peasantry. This land reform specifically targeted the private lands owned by the United Fruit Company. The UFC did not appreciate this and immediately went to United States President Dwight Eisenhower for help. In 1952, Eisenhower then moved to begin what's now known as Operation PV Fortune. This op was designed to install pro-American and pro-United Fruit Company forces into power, which ushered in 30-plus years of civil war in the country. The coup in itself will be a topic for another video, but in the meantime we can understand that democratically elected government was overthrown by the United States and its forces of capital that it backed. The 30-year-plus long Guatemalan Civil War was also an opportunity for reactionary forces in the country to begin a genocidal campaign on the indigenous Mayan population. The Mayan genocide in itself can be its own series, but for now, a quick summary. By the mid-60s, Guatemalan government forces began to target rebel groups such as PGT, M13, and in particular, Ejército Guerreros de los Pobres, or the Guatemalan Army of the Poor. These groups were part of a coalition of Guatemalan National Revolutionary Units, the main driving force for the insurgency against the United States-backed government. The Ejército was extremely popular amongst the Mayan population in northern Guatemala. The Ejército took much of its ideological inspiration from Che Guevara, believing that armed struggle of the oppressed nationals was the best way to gain their liberation. As the group reformatted, they believed that they had not included enough indigenous Mayans into the movement. As they made this change, they also drew major inspiration from the Vietnam struggle against the United States. Both nations were agrarian and were both battlegrounds between capitalism and communism. The U.S.-backed government of Guatemala saw the Mayan population as siding with insurgents, and from 1975 to 1980s carried out over 600 massacres of native populations, leading to a total of 166,000 deaths and 40,000 people, quote, disappearing. We must remind ourselves that this civil war, the U.S.-backed coup, and what is now known as the Silent Holocaust, all started for the United Fruit Company's desire to protect lands that they deemed as their own, for at the time, the United Fruit Company owned 80% of the land in the country. These lands were used to make a profit. Although, when Arbenz was overthrown, Guatemala did not become an official colony of the United States, it was very clear that the United States and its corporate backers could dictate how Latin American nations were able to run. The ones who suffered the most were the indigenous Mayan populations in Guatemala's case. So far, we have established how colonization and capitalism feed into each other, and the need for profit is an ever-present driving force. Way back in the 1500s and in the following centuries, as well as in our grandparents' day in the 1950s. But this process is still ongoing and has only occurred just a few short years ago, in 2019, when the forces of capital tried to coup the indigenous president of Bolivia, Evo Morales. In 2019, the Bolivian general election was underway. President Evo Morales found himself with over 40% of the popular vote. Evo was running after a referendum to limit the nation's term limits was rejected. The so-called international community decried this as a human rights violation. But we know that the United States and Europe don't ever care for human rights. This was a blatant attempt at something bigger. Evo Morales left the country and mass demonstrations ensued. After 19 days of unrest between pro and anti-Morales forces, new elections were held. Luis Arce won the popular vote by a landslide, he being a member of the same party Evo was, the Movements for Socialism party. He won with 55% of the popular vote. But why was there such a conceited effort to overthrow Evo, when the results clearly show support for his party? The answer lies in Bolivia's natural resources. Prior to the coup attempt in 2019, 12 lawmakers in Bolivia sent a letter to then U.S. President Donald Trump to use his influence and power of the Organization of American States to somehow prevent Evo Morales from running for president. The United States has for over a century opposed its will on South America. The OAS was the organization that originally found fault with the election results of Evo's victory and made the calls for his resignation. Washington was also very critical of Bolivia's relationship with Venezuela, longtime enemy. Bolivia has the world's largest deposit of lithium in the world. Lithium is used in modern-day electronics as well as electric vehicles. Billionaire Elon Musk came under fire in the summer of 2020. When directly asked about the US-backed coup in Bolivia, he responded with, We coup who we want. Deal with it. Now, a tweet is not an admission of guilt. However, we recognize the influence the bourgeois have on the world, and to deny that is to be willfully ignorant. Even at the time of recording, bourgeois media questioned the actions of the OAS and their role in Bolivia's instability. Once again, capitalism and neocolonization strikes. Bolivia, a nation where the population is 68% mestizo and 20% indigenous, was not allowed to dictate its own fate. Instead, American backers came in at the final hour and attempted to impose their will on the native population. The need for capitalism to expand is ever present, and it once again results in neocolonization. If the coup attempt were successful, then multinational corporations would immediately seek ways to extract even more profit and resources in the region. With these three examples, we can see that capitalism has always been the enemy of indigenous nations and will continue to do so unless overthrown.
Part 2. Fall of Capitalism and the Liberation of Nations. America is a jailhouse of oppressed nationalities. I want to make note that there are more than just indigenous nations within the United States. There are also Black and Chicano nations who also deserve self-determination and liberation within the jailhouse. There are plenty of examples that prove indigenous people are better under indigenous rule, environmentally and socially. Take Nunavut, Canada, for example. In 1999, the Inuit of Canada's eastern Arctic region established the territory of Nunavut through the Nunavut Land Agreement. This agreement granted the Inuit substantial control over their land, resources, and governance. Since its establishment, Nunavut has seen improvements in education, healthcare, and cultural preservation. The Inuit have been able to govern according to their traditional values and protect their unique way of life. In 2009, Bolivia elected its first indigenous president, Evo Morales, who is of Amaya descent. Under Morales' leadership, Bolivia made significant progress in reducing poverty rates and improving access to education and healthcare for indigenous communities. His government also promoted indigenous languages and cultural traditions. If you'd like a separate video on this subject, comment below. There are 4 key factors when it comes to the liberation of indigenous people around the globe. Number 1, the fall of capitalism is crucial to the liberation of indigenous people. As mentioned before by Comrade Ivan, capitalism and colonialism has never treated indigenous people fairly. Ever since the Spanish ships flowed in, the generation went on for generations to come. Certain events and policies that affect indigenous people today, for instance colonization, disposition of land, forced assimilation, and residential schools, laws that limited access to healthcare, indigenous communities, especially those in remote or rural areas, often have limited access to healthcare facilities and medical services. Geographical barriers, inadequate infrastructure, and lack of healthcare funding to indigenous communities, especially those in remote or rural areas. Due to these material conditions, indigenous people have generational, environmental, and economic trauma that requires land back, reparations, and far more that can be stated here. Indigenous people require a specific science, a specific socio-economic system, and a specific theory to fully be liberated. That is Marxism-Leninism, socialism, and the national question. Number 2, recognition of national identity. One key aspect to the national question is the recognition of national identity and the right to self-determination for all ethnic groups. Stalin states in the national question that nations should be able to decide their own fate, including the possibility of secession and independent statehood if they wish so. This recognition is important and could be seen as beneficial for indigenous communities who often have distinctive cultures, languages, and historical ties to specific land, for example the Hawaiian Nation, Cherokee Nation, Alaskan Nation, and Atlan, which I'll be covering in a separate video. In summary, the recognition of national identity is an essential aspect of building cohesive and inclusive societies. National identity involves valuing cultural diversity, promoting self-determination, and respecting historical experiences, and ensuring political representation for various ethnic and cultural communities within a nation. National identity fosters a sense of belonging and pride among people, strengthening their collective identity and social solidarity. Number 3. Autonomous regions. Policies will involve the creation of autonomous regions for various ethnic groups within larger nation states. This will be done to protect and promote the cultural, social, and economic rights of these minority communities. For indigenous people, such arrangements could provide them with the power to self-governance and the ability to preserve their way of life. Number 4. Economic development. If indigenous nations see it fit, then there will be a focus on industrialization and economic development in the regions inhabited by indigenous people. This will lead to infrastructure improvements, access to education, healthcare, and economic opportunities that might have otherwise been lacking under capitalist rule. This here is a basic summation of how Marxism-Leninism would be best for indigenous nations. We established how capitalism is the enemy of not only the working class, but indigenous people all around the world. We see how the forces of capital has always sought to exploit the peoples of the quote-unquote New World. The 4 key tenets, the fall of capital, recognition of national identity, autonomous regions, and economic development are the guiding stones for how we believe indigenous nations would be liberated by Marxism-Leninism. Thank you for sticking around and watching the whole video. If you haven't already, subscribe to Collective TV and tune in to our weekly podcast. This has been Muerte.
And this has been Ivan. Thank you for watching. As Muerte said, tune in to our weekly podcast and follow us on Instagram and TikTok.